Hey, welcome back to the channel. My name is Jennifer, and I'll be narrating today's story. This is a piece of human-written science fiction, so get comfortable and let's jump right in.
She saw him burying a fallen enemy and realized her people had lied. If you enjoy this channel, please take a moment to check if you're subscribed. The observation post hummed with the ambient radiation of Kepler 442b's twin suns filtering through the reinforced viewport. Varissa pressed herself against the monitoring array, her golden amber eyes tracking the human soldier through the thermal imaging suite. The screens rendered him in shades of white and amber, a figure moving with deliberate precision across the scarred settlement grounds. She had been watching Gabriel for 3 weeks. The Valorian High Command had assigned her to the Border Observation Detail, expecting documentation of human brutality. Varissa was perfect for the task. Decorated intelligence officer, daughter of a man lost to human savagery, career built on the righteous contempt her people carried for the species that had supposedly murdered her father. The assignment was routine. Gather evidence, file reports, reinforce the necessity of the Valorian military doctrine that kept their civilization prepared for inevitable conflict. Nothing about this day was routine. Gabriel knelt beside the body of a Valorian soldier, the one killed in yesterday's skirmish. The territorial dispute had been minor. A border violation quickly repelled, but it had cost lives on both sides. Varissa had watched the combat unfold through satellite feeds, had seen the human units suppress their firepower to avoid civilian casualties in the nearby settlement, had noted the unusual restraint. She had filed her report with clinical precision, noting that the humans had fought defensively rather than aggressively. She should have noticed then, should have marked it as aberration. Now, watching Gabriel move through a ritual that had no place in human culture, Varissa felt something fracture in her chest. He carried the fallen Valorian with surprising gentleness, despite the weight, despite the body's stiffness. The human's weathered face, lined and scarred and threaded with gray, held an expression of concentration she had not expected from a soldier. His sandy hair caught the low light as he bent, and his blue-gray eyes moved across the terrain with purpose. Gabriel selected a location near an outcropping of pale stone. He began to dig with his hands. Varissa's breath caught. She leaned closer to the viewport, her emerald skin momentarily catching the reflected light of the screens. The bioluminescent tracings along her cheekbones, the marks of her bloodline's military heritage, seemed to pulse with her racing heartbeat. He was burying the enemy soldier, not disposing of the body, not leaving it exposed as trophy or insult, burying it with care, with ceremony. Gabriel worked steadily, moving earth aside, deepening the grave with methods that spoke of experience. His hands, scarred powerful, moved with a reverence that belonged in temples, not war zones. When the grave reached appropriate depth, he climbed out and returned to the body. The ritual began. He arranged the fallen Valorian's limbs with respect, straightening the posture, positioning the arms across the chest in a gesture that Varissa recognized from her childhood, a gesture she had not seen in decades, a gesture that belonged to funeral rites her own people had abandoned generations ago, dismissed as primitive alongside so much else. From his pack, Gabriel withdrew items Varissa could not clearly identify through the thermal imaging. He placed them around the body, stones, she thought, arranged with geometric precision. Then he began to speak. Not words, not in any language she expected. The sound that emerged from Gabriel was rhythmic, tonal, a cadence that carried meaning without translation. It was a prayer, a warrior's farewell, a recognition that even in death, even across species, the fallen deserved dignity. Varissa found her hand pressed against the viewport. Her golden eyes stung with moisture that had no logical explanation. She had grown up believing humans were incapable of ritual, incapable of honor, incapable of seeing the value in those they defeated. The propaganda she had absorbed through every educational institution on Valorian Prime told her that humans were tactically inferior, emotionally unstable, driven by base appetites and tribal violence. They were the reason for military readiness, the reason for expansion into border territories, the reason Valorian civilization needed to remain vigilant and strong. Watching Gabriel cover the grave with methodical care, she understood with sudden, shattering clarity that something in that narrative was profoundly wrong. He filled the grave with the same soil he had removed, his movements slow and respectful. When the earth was level, he placed larger stones in the pattern he had arranged around the body, a circle, geometric and perfect. He added more stones to the center, building what appeared to be a cairn. His hands moved with the confidence of someone who had performed this ritual before, many times before. When he finished, Gabriel remained on his knees beside the grave, his head bowed, his hands pressed flat against the earth, and even through the distance, through the layers of surveillance equipment and atmosphere and the gulf between their species, Varissa could see his shoulders shaking. The human was mourning. He stayed there for a duration that military protocol would mark as unnecessary. Minutes passed. His grief did not diminish, it deepened, moved through phases from shock to sorrow to something that looked almost like acceptance. A human soldier mourning an enemy soldier, honoring the death of someone his government had classified as a threat. Varissa's hands gripped the edge of the monitoring console. Her heart, the three-chambered Valorian heart that had been trained to metabolic calm through military discipline, was racing. Every truth she had built her identity upon suddenly felt fragile. Gabriel rose finally, moving with the stiffness of someone who had knelt on hard ground while carrying the weight of grief. He looked toward the outpost, his eyes scanning the landscape with the practiced awareness of a trained soldier. For one unimaginable moment, Varissa thought he might be looking directly at her position, might somehow sense her watching him experience something he clearly believed was private. But he turned away and walked back toward his encampment, his pace steady, his posture carrying something new. Not despair, something closer to resolve. Varissa remained at the viewport long after he disappeared from view. The screens had returned to their ambient feeds, dust patterns, thermal signatures of the human settlement, the slow rotation of geological formations in the distance. Everything appeared normal. Everything had changed. She reached for her reporting terminal, her long teal-green hair catching the light as she leaned forward. Her fingers hovered over the input keys. The report was expected within the hour. Standard documentation of human military activity, behavioral observations, assessment of threat level. What was she going to write? That she had witnessed a human displaying more honor than most Valorian commanders? That something her entire civilization had taught her was a lie? Varissa pulled her hands back from the terminal. She needed to understand what she had seen. She needed to investigate. And against every protocol, against every training her position demanded, she knew she could not file a report that diminished what had just happened. The observation began as duty. It would become something far more dangerous. Varissa stood, her teal hair falling across her shoulders as she looked back toward the burial site. The cairn Gabriel had built stood in the fading light like a monument to everything the Valorian Council had told her was unthinkable. A human with honor, a human with a ritual, a human treating an enemy with dignity. Her father would have known this was possible. The thought emerged unbidden, carrying with it decades of suppressed questions. Her father dead in human space, dead at human hands, according to the official records, or dead to her because he had abandoned the lies. The classified archives were accessible only through her intelligence officer clearance, and Varissa had spent the last 6 hours ensuring her access would not trigger tracking alerts. The encryption protocols she bypassed were standard military grade. Her expertise made them transparent. She sat in the privacy of her assigned quarters, the bioluminescent markings along her cheekbones dimmed to near invisibility, and scrolled through decades of records. Gabriel's file was comprehensive. Born on Earth, enlisted at 22, advanced through special operations training with exceptional marks, multiple commendations, multiple disciplinary reports for insubordination, specifically, refusal to follow orders that violated what he called his operational code. The documents referred to him as problematic but effective, a soldier who achieved objectives while maintaining standards that his superiors found inconvenient. The behavioral notes painted a picture of a man who had fundamentally reorganized his understanding of warfare at some point in his career. The change was marked in the files, a discrete folder labeled Incident at Valorian Border 2247. Varissa's hands stilled on the input device. She opened the folder, her heart rate climbing. The incident report was heavily redacted, but fragments remained visible. A mission gone wrong. A Valorian soldier, wounded, separated from his unit, presumably hostile. Gabriel had made contact. The report indicated that instead of neutralizing the threat, Gabriel had provided medical assistance. Had spent 3 days ensuring the Valorian soldier received care. Had then arranged for the soldier to be returned to Valorian territory rather than taken as prisoner. The investigation into Gabriel's actions had been substantial. The human soldier had been questioned repeatedly. The final notation indicated that after extensive review, the incident had been classified as cultural misunderstanding and filed. Gabriel had received a formal reprimand and had been transferred to border duty, what appeared to be punishment for his violation of protocol. Except the transfer coincided with his elevation to leadership of a specialized unit, a unit that, according to the operational summaries Varissa could access, had the lowest casualty rates of any human military force deployed to the Valorian border. She found references to his teaching, soldiers reporting that Gabriel instructed them in what he called the warrior's philosophy, that he taught them to see Valorian soldiers not as enemies to be defeated but as humans, alien humans, but humans nonetheless, deserving of respect. The reports from his commanding officers were conflicted. Gabriel produced results. His unit was disciplined, effective, innovative, but he was politically problematic. His philosophy of honor-based combat was not aligned with military objectives. There were notations suggesting that promotion beyond his current rank had been blocked due to concerns about his reliability in future conflicts. Varissa leaned back from the display, her golden eyes burning with the effort of processing information that contradicted everything she had been taught about human psychology. If Gabriel's behavior was aberrant, there should be notations about trauma, psychological fracturing, evidence of breakdown. Instead, the reviews described a soldier who had become more effective, more capable, more respected by his unit after embracing this philosophy of honor. She searched deeper, pushing through secondary archives that were technically above her clearance. It took 40 minutes to find the reference she was seeking. Researcher Kieran Varos, she whispered, reading the name on a decade-old communication log. The name appeared in a list of human contacts flagged for involvement in what the Valorian intelligence summary called subversive peace advocacy. Kieran Varos. That had been her father's name. Varissa's hands were shaking. She pulled up the summary file, forced herself to read the clinical assessment of a man she had mourned her entire life. The file indicated that Kieran Varos had been a human researcher stationed at the Joint Cultural Exchange Program on Valorian Prime. He had married a Valorian woman. No surprise there. The file noted dryly, cross-species partnerships were becoming increasingly common despite regulatory discouragement. He had been employed by the human government as a diplomatic liaison. According to the Valorian intelligence assessment, Kieran Varos had begun sharing classified information about Valorian military expansion plans with peace advocacy groups. He had coordinated with human government officials to propose negotiated solutions to border disputes. He had, in essence, betrayed Valorian security protocols by attempting to prevent conflict. The file indicated he had disappeared from Valorian Prime 28 years ago, fleeing ahead of criminal charges. His departure had been marked as confirmation of the information warfare campaign. The human had been exposed, had fled, demonstrating the human government's willingness to use spies and infiltrators. The file made no mention of Varissa, no acknowledgement that a child had been left behind. She closed the archive, her breathing shallow. The story she had lived with her entire life was not a lie. It was a truth that had been systematically inverted. Her father had not been a victim of human brutality. He had been a threat to Valorian military interests. He had been driven away, or had chosen to leave, because he had discovered that his adopted civilization was manufacturing reasons for conflict. Gabriel had known him. The thought crystallized with certainty. Gabriel had met her father at some point, had been changed by that meeting, had reorganized his entire approach to warfare based on principles a human should never have encountered unless someone had taught them to him. Varissa needed to speak with Gabriel. The decision violated every protocol. She should report her findings to the command structure, should document her investigation and return to the straightforward task of surveillance and reporting, should accept the comfortable architecture of the world she had been given. Instead, she began planning how to make contact. Gabriel's unit conducted routine patrols in the buffer zone between territories. Varissa accessed the patrol schedules, information that was not protected, intended for human coordination purposes. The next patrol would move through the abandoned research station near the geological fault line. The station had been decommissioned 15 years ago, was marked for demolition, but had never been scheduled. It existed in a pocket of administrative neglect. It would be empty. She filed a false duty report indicating she would be conducting remote geological surveys in the region. She checked out a surveillance drone, claiming it was for border monitoring. She did these things with the careful precision of someone who had been trained to cover her tracks, and she tried not to think about what each action meant. She was beginning to betray her people, or she was beginning to see them clearly for the first time. The distinction mattered, but she could not yet afford to examine it. The research station smelled of dust and time. Varissa had arrived 3 hours before Gabriel's patrol was scheduled to pass through the region, had disabled the external surveillance monitoring with a carefully deployed signal scrambler, and had positioned herself in the station's central chamber where visibility extended in all directions. Her hands were steady. Her breathing was controlled. Every aspect of her Valorian military training activated in preparation for an encounter that could end in capture, death, or discovery of truths she was not certain she could survive knowing. She heard the patrol before she saw them, the sound of military transport engines cutting through the thin atmosphere of Kepler 442b. 3 vehicles, standard configuration. She watched through the observation port as the transport halted and soldiers dismounted. Gabriel was among them, his sandy hair visible even from the distance. He moved with the same careful precision she had observed during the burial, checking sight lines, assessing the abandoned structure with the practiced awareness of someone who understood that danger could emerge from unexpected locations. He separated from his unit with a hand signal, indicating he would conduct interior reconnaissance. The other soldiers established perimeter security, their weapons held with the casual readiness of trained soldiers who expected no resistance. Gabriel entered the station alone. Varissa stepped into the central chamber, her teal hair catching the pale light filtering through the high windows. She positioned herself with her hands visible, her posture non-threatening, her expression carefully neutral. Gabriel's weapon rose immediately, his eyes narrowing. For an eternal moment, neither of them moved. Valorian, he said, his voice deeper than she had expected, rougher with the texture of someone who had not slept well. That's not a standard border patrol area. Varissa forced her voice to remain steady. I am conducting research in the region, geological surveys. I was not aware this station was being monitored. It was a transparent lie. Gabriel's expression suggested he recognized it as such. But he did not lower his weapon. Instead, he adjusted his grip and waited for her to continue speaking. I have observed your military operations, Varissa said, abandoning the pretense of the lie. I have questions. Questions about what? About why a human soldier buries an enemy with ceremony. Gabriel's jaw tightened. His weapon remained raised, but she could see the moment he stopped viewing her as immediate threat and began viewing her as something more complex, something that required assessment rather than elimination. You were watching, he said. It was not a question. Yes, that was a private moment. Yes, she repeated, and she allowed herself to look directly into his eyes despite the weapon between them. It was a private moment that contradicts everything I have been told about your species. Gabriel lowered the weapon slowly, his blue-gray eyes moving across her face as though searching for something. A lie, a threat, a reason to fire. "Your government tells you that humans are savage," he said quietly. "Your government tells you that Valorians are righteous," she countered. "I am beginning to understand that both narratives are false." Something shifted in Gabriel's posture. The weapon lowered further, and he stepped into the chamber with the same deliberate movement he had used to grave the fallen soldier. "Who are you?" he asked. Varissa hesitated at the threshold of a choice that could not be unmade. Lying would buy her time, would preserve the possibility of maintaining her cover. But something about the way Gabriel had mourned the fallen soldier, something about the way he carried himself as though his honor was more important than his survival, suggested that he would recognize dishonesty and would respond to it by cutting off all connection. "My name is Varissa," she said. "I am a Valorian intelligence officer. I am supposed to be reporting your movements to my command structure." Gabriel's hand moved back to his weapon, but slowly, as though the action was reflexive rather than determined. "Are you?" he asked. "I have not filed a report since I observed your burial ceremony," Varissa said. "I have begun accessing classified files. I have violated multiple security protocols to determine if what I witnessed was genuine or an anomaly in your behavior." "And what did you find?" "That you learned to honor enemies from someone," Varissa said carefully. "That you were changed by an encounter with a human researcher. That the researcher's name was Kieran Varos." Gabriel's entire body went rigid. The weapon fell completely to his side. His eyes, which had been cautious, suddenly held the same devastation she had seen when he knelt at the grave. "How do you know that name?" His voice cracked on the question. "Because Kieran Varos was my father." The words hung in the dust-laden air between them. Gabriel stared at her as though she had stepped out of another reality, as though her presence was unbelievable, as though the universe was reorganizing itself around this moment. "Your father," Gabriel said finally, his voice rough with emotion he was struggling to control. "You're his daughter. Varissa, he spoke of you. He had a daughter on Valorian Prime. He—" Gabriel turned away, his shoulders shaking. "He thought you hated him for leaving." Varissa felt the ground shift beneath her. "He is alive." Yes, he is alive. He's on the frontier colonies. He has been working for decades to achieve what both our governments have been actively preventing: actual peace, built on truth instead of propaganda. Varissa moved toward him, and Gabriel turned to face her, his expression raw and open in a way that no soldier should allow himself to appear to a potential enemy. She could see in his weathered face the younger man her father must have met, could imagine the moment when honor had reorganized his understanding of the universe. "My government killed my mother," Varissa said quietly. The realization emerged as she spoke it, connected to itself through the fragmented pieces of memory and classified files. "They told me she died of a natural illness." "But she discovered something, didn't she? Something about the war manufacturing." Gabriel nodded slowly. "Your father found that out after she died. It's why he left. He couldn't stay in a system that had eliminated his partner for asking too many questions. He couldn't raise a daughter in a civilization built on lies." The pain of that knowledge, that her father had left her because he had no choice, because staying would have killed him or seen him imprisoned, because leaving was the only way to survive with his humanity intact, struck Varissa with the force of a detonation. Gabriel closed the distance between them, and before she could process what was happening, he was pulling her toward him, his arms wrapping around her with the same careful reverence he had used to handle the fallen soldier. She found herself pressed against his chest, his hands supporting her as though she might shatter, his voice low against her ear. "You're exactly like him," Gabriel said. "You came here to understand the truth. You risked everything to find out if honor was possible." Varissa allowed herself to remain in his arms for a moment longer than protocol permitted. Her head rested against his shoulder. She could feel his heartbeat, rapid, heavy, steady, beneath her ear. This human soldier, this man who had reorganized warfare around principles of compassion, was holding her as though she was precious to him, as though she mattered. When she pulled back, Gabriel did not release her immediately. His hands dropped from her back slowly, reluctantly, and his eyes held hers with an intensity that made her bioluminescent markings flare brighter along her cheekbones. "I cannot report this," Varissa said. "I know. My government will begin to suspect my silence." "I know," Gabriel repeated, "but we have time. Your father, he would want to meet you. He has spent 3 decades believing that was impossible." Varissa nodded, unable to speak. Gabriel reached out and gently touched the luminescent tracery along her cheekbone, his scarred hand barely brushing her skin. The gesture was infinitely tender, and it carried within it a promise she could not yet define. "There is so much you do not know," Gabriel said quietly, "so much your government has kept from you, and I want to tell you all of it. I want you to understand who your father really is, but I need you to be safe first." "I am compromised," Varissa said. "My actions can no longer be hidden." "Then let's make sure that when they discover your betrayal, you have the truth to stand on," Gabriel said. "Your father spent 30 years building that truth. Now it's time for it to reach the light." He released her fully, and Varissa felt the loss of his touch like a physical absence. But before they could speak further, the sound of Gabriel's communication unit crackled to life, his unit signaling that the patrol needed to move on. "I need to go," he said, though his eyes remained on her face. "But I will return to this location in 2 days. Will you be here?" "Yes," Varissa said without hesitation. Gabriel retrieved his weapon, checked it with trained precision, and moved toward the exit. At the threshold, he turned back to look at her one final time, his expression carrying gratitude and sorrow and something else, something that looked very much like recognition. "Your father named you Varissa," he said. "It means shining truth in the human dialect he learned from the frontier colonies. He chose that name hoping you might someday understand what he was trying to protect." Then he was gone, and Varissa was alone in the station with the weight of 30 years of disconnection, the possibility of reconciliation, and the certain knowledge that she was about to become her government's enemy. The data crystal Gabriel placed on the table contained 3 decades of evidence. Varissa moved through the files in Gabriel's quarters, accessing information that had been gathered in secret, analyzed in hiding, organized by her father over years of painstaking work. The layout was meticulous: documentation of fabricated border incidents, correspondence between Valorian military commanders discussing which settlements to target to justify military expansion, economic reports detailing resource seizure disguised as war reparations. Her government had not been defending against human aggression. They had been manufacturing conflict to justify conquest. And her mother, her brilliant, curious mother, had discovered the documentation, had confronted the command structure about the systematic falsification of intelligence reports, had died in what was classified as a natural cause, but had taken effect within 3 weeks of her inquiry. Varissa's hand trembled as she accessed the final communication logs, messages from her father to her mother, written in the weeks before her death, declarations of love and promises to keep Varissa safe no matter what, plans to extract her and her mother from Valorian Prime. The last message was dated the day before her mother had collapsed. "I could not protect her," Gabriel said quietly from the entrance to his quarters. He had not knocked, had entered with the familiarity of someone who had access to private spaces. "Your father tried. He went to the authorities with the evidence. He asked them to acknowledge the truth. Instead, they moved to arrest him and eliminate any witnesses who might corroborate his claims." Varissa looked up from the display, her golden eyes dark with tears she had not allowed to fall. "How long have you known all of this?" "Since the day your father pulled me out of a combat zone and spent the next week showing me evidence of every lie I had believed," Gabriel said. He moved across the room and positioned himself beside her, not touching, respecting the boundary of her shock. He explained how his own government had turned on him. "He taught me that the enemy is not the Valorian soldiers we fight. The enemy is the system that forces soldiers to fight on behalf of lies." "My superiors suspect something," Varissa said quietly. "I have been called for a status review. They want to verify my loyalty." Gabriel's expression hardened. "When?" 3 days. I'm expected back at the command center. Then we have 3 days to decide if you return, Gabriel said, and she could hear the weight of what he was offering. To help her disappear, to help her join her father, to become a traitor to everything she had built. Varissa turned to face him, and Gabriel's careful distance evaporated. He moved toward her with the same deliberation that had characterized every action since she had met him. His hands came up to frame her face, his scarred thumbs brushing away tears she had not realized were running down her cheeks. You don't have to come back, he said quietly. You don't have to maintain this cover. You can choose truth instead of comfort. And if I choose truth, then you will face your people's anger. You will be marked as a traitor. You will lose everything you have built, Gabriel said. He was not offering her an escape from consequences. He was offering her clarity about what she was actually choosing. But you will know your father. You will understand who your mother really was. You will be free. Varissa closed her eyes, and Gabriel's hands remained steady against her face. She could feel the warmth of him, the solidity, the reality of his presence as counterweight to the dissolution of her certainties. When she opened her eyes, Gabriel was watching her with an intensity that made her bioluminescent markings flare brighter. His blue-gray eyes held hers without judgment, without pressure, simply offering himself as anchor while she navigated the abyss. She reached up and pulled his head down toward hers, and he came without resistance, his mouth finding hers in a connection that felt like recognition, like homecoming. The kiss was slow and careful, a negotiation of trust more than a demand of passion. Gabriel's hand slid from her face to her waist, his fingers spreading across the small of her back, drawing her closer. Varissa's hands found the fabric of his shirt and gripped it as though it might be her only tether to reality. When they broke apart, Gabriel rested his forehead against hers, his breathing ragged. I love you, he said, and the words carried the weight of someone stating fact rather than declaration. I don't know if that matters, given everything, but I needed you to know it before you make your choice. Varissa had been trained to control her emotions, to view connection as vulnerability, to see love as weakness. But standing in Gabriel's quarters, surrounded by evidence of her government's crimes and her father's decades of exile, she understood that love was the only thing that had ever been real. I will not return to the command center, she said. I will access the files they believe are secure. I will gather evidence of every lie they have told me, and then I will expose them. Gabriel pulled back to look at her, surprise and something like pride flickering across his expression. You're going to fight. I am going to fight for the truth, Varissa corrected. For my father. For my mother's memory. For every Valorian and human who has died because my government manufactured conflict to justify expansion. Gabriel kissed her again, and this time the kiss carried different energy. Recognition of a partner, acknowledgement of shared purpose, promise of the battle ahead. Your father is going to be very proud of you, Gabriel said when he finally released her. My father will be terrified, Varissa replied, as am I. Good, Gabriel said, and there was something almost like smile in his weathered face. Courage is not absence of fear, it is choosing to act despite the terror. They remained together through the night, not in the physical intimacy that might have provided escape, but in the deeper intimacy of planning, of accessing files, of building the case that would reshape both their civilizations. Gabriel taught her how to access and copy data without triggering security alerts. Varissa demonstrated the architectural weaknesses in Valorian military intelligence systems that she had learned through years of authorized access. By dawn, they had accumulated enough evidence to warrant investigation, but not enough to guarantee victory. What they had was a beginning. We need to move your father into position, Varissa said, looking at the compilation of evidence they had assembled. If we release this without corroboration, my government will have time to suppress it, to claim fabrication, to continue denying the truth. He is already aware of the situation, Gabriel said. Your father has contacts throughout human space. Once you provide the proof, he can ensure simultaneous release across both civilizations. Human news networks and the dissidents within Valorian society who have been waiting for evidence to support their claims of corruption. Varissa nodded, understanding the scope of what had been built in the decades since her father had fled. He had not disappeared. He had reorganized. "I need to retrieve the original intelligence reports from the secure archives," Varissa said, "the ones that would prove direct falsification. Without those, everything else is interpretation." "That's the most dangerous part," Gabriel said quietly. "If you access those files, security will flag your account. They will know you are actively compromised." Then I must make it count," Varissa said. She stood, her long teal hair falling down her back, her golden eyes burning with purpose. "I will access everything at once. Download the complete archive. Create a cascade of security alerts that will overwhelm their response protocols while my father's allies establish the release infrastructure." Gabriel stood with her, his hands coming to rest on her shoulders. "This is going to cost you everything." "Everything I have cost me already," Varissa said, understanding the truth of it. "All the years I spent accepting comfortable lies, those years were stolen from me. This costs me nothing. I was ever actually mine." For 8 days, Varissa maintained the performance of loyalty while building the architecture of betrayal. She returned to the Valorian Command Center with a false report, claiming she had been investigating human military capabilities and needed to cross-reference data with secure archives. Her superiors, satisfied that she was diligent in her duties, granted the access. They had no reason to suspect her. Varissa had spent her entire career demonstrating unwavering commitment to their mission. She used that trust to systematically download 30 years of falsified intelligence. The reports were meticulous in their deception, border incidents that had never occurred, documented with fabricated sensor data, civilian casualties attributed to human aggression when the settlements had been deliberately targeted by Valorian forces themselves, resource estimates inflated to justify military seizure, every justification for war, exposed as deliberately constructed fiction. Varissa created shadow accounts to move the data, using her expertise to route the transfers through channels that would not immediately trigger alerts. She accessed psychological profiles used to determine which population segments could be most effectively convinced of human threat. She found the records of her mother's death, a clinical notation indicating inconvenient question as the motivation, the method disguised as natural cause. Each file felt like a piece of her identity dissolving and reforming into something harder and more real. Gabriel maintained regular contact through encrypted communications routed through civilian channels. Her father's network was preparing distribution infrastructure. Once Varissa provided the complete archive, the release would be simultaneous across human media outlets and Valorian underground networks. The information would propagate faster than any government suppression could contain. 5 days before her scheduled extraction, Varissa's commanding officer called her into a private meeting. Commander Svetral was the architect of the expansion strategy, the military intelligence director who had personally ordered her mother's elimination and her father's destruction. He was a thin, angular man, with the cold posture of someone who had long ago accepted that his actions were justified by necessity. "You have been conducting extensive research into historical intelligence assessments," Svetral said, his flat eyes assessing her from across his desk. "I want to understand your purpose." Varissa's heartbeat remained controlled. "I am examining protocols for improving analytical accuracy. Our border assessments have been challenged by human diplomatic counter-arguments, and I am investigating whether our methodologies are sufficiently rigorous." "Your research focuses specifically on incidents involving Kieran Veros," Svetral continued, "the human researcher who attempted to undermine our military integrity." This was the moment. Varissa could deny, could deflect, could claim intellectual curiosity about a historical anomaly. She could buy herself more time. Instead, she chose the path her father would have chosen. "Kieran Veros was my father," Varissa said quietly. "I have been investigating the circumstances of his departure from Valorian Prime." Svetral's expression did not change, but she could see the recalculation happening behind his eyes. "And what have you concluded?" "That my government systematically lied about the reasons for his exile, that his concerns about the veracity of our intelligence were justified, that we have been manufacturing conflict with humanity for 3 decades. Svetral leaned back in his chair, and Varissa could see the moment he accepted that interrogation would not break her cover because she was no longer maintaining it. "How much have you accessed?" he asked. "Enough," Varissa said. Svetral's hand moved toward a communication device, but Varissa was already moving. She had trained for this moment across the past 8 days, had understood that once her position was exposed, speed would determine survival. She crossed the desk in fluid motion and disabled the device before the emergency signal could transmit. Security lockdown initiated, the AI announced in calm tones, all exits sealed. "You have condemned yourself," Svetral said, and there was something almost like satisfaction in his voice. "Your people will mark you as a traitor. Your name will be erased from all records. You will be executed for espionage against the Valorian state." "My people will know the truth," Varissa replied, and she triggered the final upload from her personal device. "Everything you have done, every lie you have told, every person you have murdered to maintain your fiction." The security alerts began immediately. Red lights flooded the command center. Alarm systems activated with the howling wail of a civilization mobilizing to contain a breach. Varissa did not attempt to escape through the conventional exits. Instead, she moved toward the high window and triggered the emergency atmospheric seal release just as security forces burst through the door. The decompression was violent and immediate. The security team was thrown backward by the rushing atmosphere as Varissa, her Valorian physiology adapted for environmental extremes, propelled herself out of the window using the explosive force of the depressurization. She fell 3 stories into the landing platform and hit the surface of a human transport that Gabriel had positioned exactly where she needed it. The impact drove air from her lungs, but she was moving immediately, pulling herself into the interior of the vessel as Gabriel's hands grabbed her and pulled her toward safety. The transport was already lifting as gunfire erupted from the command center. Not laser fire. They would not risk destroying the building itself, but they were shooting, were attempting to force the transport down, were committed to stopping her escape. Gabriel was in the pilot's seat, and he moved the transport with the precision of someone who had planned this trajectory perfectly. He threaded through the defensive fire, used the surrounding architecture as cover, and accelerated toward the upper atmosphere with the engines screaming in protest. "Status," he called, his focus on the controls as the transport shuddered under attack. "Files uploaded," Varissa called back, collapsing against the wall of the cabin, her breathing ragged, her bioluminescent markings blazing brilliantly with the surge of adrenaline through her system. "Signal is propagating." "Good," Gabriel said. He pushed the transport harder, and suddenly they broke through the upper atmosphere, leaving the planet's defenses below them. "Your father is coordinating the releases. In 3 hours, every human news network will broadcast the evidence. In 6, the moderate Valorian faction will have provided the materials to underground media outlets. By tomorrow, your government's lies will be known to both our civilizations." Varissa moved to the viewport and looked back at Valorian Prime, the home she had known, the culture that had shaped her, the lies that had defined her existence. She understood she would never return there as anything other than enemy. "My mother would have wanted this," she said quietly. Gabriel turned from the controls briefly, reaching back to take her hand. His grip was warm and steady and absolutely certain. "She would have been proud of you." The frontier colony appeared suddenly through the transport's viewport, a structure built into a mountain face, camouflaged against the rust-colored rock, deliberately designed to remain invisible to casual observation. Gabriel guided the transport toward the landing platform with the confidence of someone who had made this journey before. Varissa had not spoken in the hours since their escape. She had sat in the observation cabin, watching the evidence propagate across every network they could access, seeing the Valorian government's initial attempt to deny the authenticity of the files, watching as human analysts confirmed the dates and signatures matched official records, observing the fracturing of her civilization's propaganda as truth emerged from beneath decades of manufactured narrative. She felt simultaneously hollowed and absolutely present. The person she had been was gone. The person she was becoming had not yet fully materialized. She existed in the space between identities. Gabriel had left her to that space without intrusion. He had monitored communications, had coordinated with her father's network, had guided them safely through 2 defensive patrol encounters. He had done everything except attempt to pull her from her internal dissolution. Now, as the transport descended toward the landing platform, he appeared at her shoulder. "He is waiting for you," Gabriel said quietly. "He has been waiting for 30 years. Varissa turned to face him, and Gabriel's expression shifted as he saw the tears that had finally escaped her careful control. He reached out with the same reverence he had shown burying the fallen soldier, and he pulled her against his chest. "I don't know how to be his daughter," Varissa said into his shoulder. "I don't know how to reconcile that with everything I have been." "You don't have to reconcile it," Gabriel said. His scarred hand was steady against the back of her head. "You just have to be willing to meet him as you are now. The rest will follow." The transport settled onto the platform and Gabriel released her. He moved toward the exit controls and paused, looking back to ensure Varissa was ready. She nodded and the ramp descended. The figure waiting at the base of the ramp was older than she remembered, though that was unreal because she had not seen him since she was 8 years old. His hair was white, his face lined with the weight of exile, his posture carrying the careful balance of someone who had learned to survive by remaining alert. He looked exactly like her. She had never noticed the similarity because she had been trained to hate the man who carried these features. Now, seeing them reflected in his face, she felt something fundamental break open in her chest. Kieran Veros took one step toward the ramp and then stopped, as though afraid that moving closer might shatter something precious. "Varissa," he said, and his voice carried 30 years of unsaid words, "my shining daughter, you came." Varissa descended the ramp and walked toward her father, and the closer she came, the more she could see the man her mother had loved. The man who had sacrificed everything to preserve his integrity. The man who had spent 3 decades building the architecture that would eventually liberate his daughter from comfortable lies. She stopped in front of him, and for a moment, neither of them moved. Then Kieran reached out, his weathered hands, scarred like Gabriel's, bearing the marks of a life lived outside the structures of comfortable civilization, came to rest on her shoulders. "You are exactly like your mother," Kieran said. "You have her courage, her willingness to see what is true even when it costs everything." Varissa allowed herself to be pulled into her father's embrace, and the feeling was both foreign and absolutely familiar. He held her as though she might disappear. As though 3 decades of separation had created a gravity that could only be satisfied through physical connection. When he released her, there were tears running down his weathered face. "Your mother's death," he said quietly. "You know what happened?" "Yes," Varissa replied. "I found the records." Kieran nodded slowly. She wanted to expose them. She was working to gather evidence, to build a case that could not be denied. Svetral discovered her inquiry. Rather than risk her becoming a martyr, they made her death appear natural. But she knew. In those final days, she knew what they had done. "She made me promise to protect you, to eventually help you understand the truth about who we are." "You left me," Varissa said, and she allowed herself to speak the accusation she had carried her entire life. "I did," Kieran said, and he did not attempt to minimize the impact. "And that failure has haunted me every single day since. I could not protect your mother. I could not save her. The only way I could honor her was by surviving, by building something that might eventually allow you to choose truth instead of accepting comfortable lies." Gabriel had been standing at respectful distance, but he moved forward now, positioning himself at Varissa's side. Kieran's eyes, the same golden amber color as his daughter's, assessed the human with the understanding of someone who had lived among Gabriel's people for 3 decades. "Gabriel," Kieran said, and he extended his hand in the human gesture of greeting. "Thank you for bringing her to safety. Thank you for teaching her what honor looks like." Gabriel accepted the hand, and in that moment, Varissa saw the thread of connection. Her father had trained Gabriel, had taught him the philosophy of honor that had reorganized his understanding of warfare. Gabriel had extended that teaching to Varissa. 3 generations of commitment to truth, linked through the simple act of a burial ceremony. "Your father has been monitoring the data release," Gabriel said to Varissa. "The Valorian government is fracturing. The military command structure is being challenged by moderate factions. Your government is acknowledging the evidence while simultaneously attempting to contain the damage." "And the human response?" Varissa asked. "There is significant anger," Kieran said. "Many humans want retribution for the manufactured conflicts, for the resources stolen, for the soldiers who died believing in lies. But there are also many who are ready to forgive if your people are willing to acknowledge the truth and commit to actual peace rather than continued deception." Varissa looked between her father and Gabriel, understanding the scope of what they had built through decades of patient work. They had created space for reconciliation by refusing to accept the narrative of permanent enmity. "What happens now?" Varissa asked. "Now," Kieran said, "we wait for the dust to settle. We continue to release evidence. We work with the moderate factions within your government to build accountability. We offer to help your people understand that human civilization is not your enemy, that the enemy has always been the systems that benefited from continued conflict." Varissa moved toward the edge of the platform and looked out across the frontier colony, a place built on the margins, sustained by people who had chosen truth over comfort. She understood that this was her home now, that the Valorian civilization she had known would never welcome her return. Gabriel came to stand beside her, and after a moment her father joined them. "Your mother would have liked this place," Kieran said quietly, "the simplicity of it, the refusal to accept easy answers." "What happens between our people?" Varissa asked. "Can this ever truly be healed?" "It begins with people like you," Gabriel said. "People willing to expose the lies from within their own civilization. People willing to build connection across the divide that propaganda created. It will take time, but truth has a power that lies can never match." Varissa felt her father's hand rest on her shoulder, a physical anchor to this moment, to her true history, to the possibility of genuine reconciliation. She looked at Gabriel, and his expression held the same quiet certainty she had seen when he buried the fallen soldier. They were building something that would outlast the anger, the recrimination, the justified fear. They were building it carefully, with patience and compassion and absolute commitment to honoring those who had died for lies. The message arrived at the frontier colony through encrypted channels Varissa's superiors were not supposed to know existed. "Surrender yourself for trial, or we execute Kieran Veros." The communication was brief, clinical, bearing Svetral's sealed authorization. "You have 48 hours. Gabriel's jaw tightened as he read the transmission. Kieran, who had been reviewing diplomatic proposals with moderate Valorian faction leaders, looked up from his work and understood immediately what had happened. "They are accelerating," Kieran said quietly. "They know they are losing control of the narrative. They are moving to eliminate the symbols of resistance." "We evacuate," Gabriel said decisively. He was already moving toward the communication console. "I am calling in my team. We have contingency protocols for this scenario." "No," Varissa said. Her voice was steady, but she could feel the bioluminescent markings along her cheekbones flaring bright with fear and adrenaline. "This is a trap. If we attempt to evacuate, they will deploy interceptors. If we run, we confirm their narrative that we are fleeing justice rather than standing on principle." "They will execute him," Gabriel said, and there was raw anguish in his expression. "Only if we validate their claim that I am more important than the truth," Varissa said. "If we surrender, they suppress the evidence and execute both of us quietly. The narrative becomes terrorist ring eliminated. If we resist, we force them to make their move publicly. We force them to choose between principle and practical necessity." Kieran moved to his daughter and placed his hand on her arm. "You are thinking like a strategist." "I learned from the best," Varissa replied. She was already accessing the communication systems, already preparing her response. "We counteroffer. A public trial. Full media access. Complete release of evidence presented during proceedings. We make it unimaginable for them to suppress the truth through coercion. They will not accept, Kieran said. Then we know they are committing to full war, Varissa replied. And the moderate factions within our government will have the proof they need to move against Svetral. Gabriel's team arrived within the hour, a unit of human soldiers trained in both combat operations and extraction protocols. They came with the same quiet competence that characterized all of Gabriel's actions, and they established defensive positions around the colony's perimeter without needing explicit orders. Varissa recorded her response to Svetral's ultimatum. I accept trial under 3 conditions. All proceedings will be broadcast simultaneously on human and Valorian networks. All evidence will be presented in full rather than selected excerpts. My father will be present as witness, not prisoner. The response came within minutes. Conditions accepted. You have 24 hours to appear at the judicial complex on Valorian Prime. Any attempt to flee, and your father will be executed. Gabriel was beside her immediately. That is not a legitimate offer. They will kill you both the moment you are in custody. Not if we make the public commitment absolute, Varissa said. I will announce the trial location and time through every human and Valorian media outlet. I will make my appearance a matter of galactic record. They cannot execute me without confirming every accusation I have made. You are gambling with your life, Kieran said. I am finishing what you and Gabriel started, Varissa replied. We cannot rebuild our civilization's relationship on a foundation of continued fear and coercion. This needs to end in public accountability, or it will never truly end at all. The journey back to Valorian Prime took 18 hours. Varissa spent the transit in Gabriel's arms, not speaking, simply drawing strength from his presence. He did not attempt to change her mind or convince her that another path was possible. He simply held her, his scarred hands steady against her teal hair, his heartbeat anchoring her to the reality that some bonds transcended species and circumstance. If something goes wrong, Gabriel said quietly as they approached Valorian's atmosphere, if they move against you despite the public commitment, I will come for you. I will burn Valorian Prime to the ground to get to you. I know, Varissa said. She lifted her head to look at him, and she saw in his weathered face the same man who had buried a fallen enemy with reverence, the same man who had taught her that honor was not abstract principle but daily choice. That is why I can walk into that trial without fear, because I know that whatever happens, you and my father have built something that truth cannot kill. The transport descended toward the judicial complex as dawn broke over Valorian Prime. The building was heavily guarded, security forces establishing perimeter that was designed to prevent escape rather than prevent assault. Varissa understood with absolute clarity that she would not leave this building alive, unless the public evidence swayed sufficient political support to mandate her release. She descended from the transport and walked toward the entrance, her long teal hair flowing behind her, her golden eyes bright with the conviction of someone who had finally aligned her actions with her truth. Kieran and Gabriel were transmitted the access codes that would allow them to monitor the trial from the human diplomatic station. She did not look back. The trial chamber was filled with representatives from both governments, media broadcasters, with equipment that was transmitting every image across star systems. Svetral stood at the prosecutorial position, his thin face holding absolute confidence that the proceedings would validate his narrative and eliminate the threat Varissa represented. Varissa seated herself in the defendant's position and waited for the questions to begin. The prosecution was meticulous and brutal. Svetral presented evidence of her security breaches, her unauthorized access to classified materials, her communications with human military personnel. He built a narrative of a Valorian officer turned traitor, influenced by human psychological manipulation, operating against her civilization's interests. And then Varissa's advocates, moderate Valorian faction leaders who had been waiting for the chance to expose the truth, began their questioning. They presented the falsified intelligence reports. They established dates and authentication signatures. They revealed the deliberate fabrication of border incidents. They produced witnesses from within the Valorian military who had been ordered to falsify data and had been silenced when they raised concerns. They executed their strategy with the precision of people who had been preparing for this moment for years. By the second day of the trial, the narrative had shifted. What had been positioned as a tribunal against a traitor had become an inquest into systematic military corruption. Svetral's confidence wavered. His responses became increasingly desperate, increasingly contradictory. On the third day, a moderate faction representative stood and called for Svetral's arrest pending investigation into the assassination of Varissa's mother. The chamber erupted in chaos. Varissa remained seated through it all, her hands folded on the table in front of her, her expression resolute. She had played her part. Now she could only wait to see if truth had enough power to reshape her civilization's foundations. The verdict was delivered on the morning of the fifth day, not guilty. The charges against Varissa were dismissed, and the court formally requested that she serve as a consultant to a new investigative body tasked with reviewing military integrity protocols. The secondary verdict, delivered within hours, was more significant. Commander Svetral was arrested and charged with corruption, conspiracy, and crimes against civilian populations. The Valorian military command structure was suspended pending comprehensive review. Emergency governance transferred to the moderate faction, which immediately announced its commitment to transparency and accountability. It was victory, but it was also incomplete. The trial had exposed the truth, but only in recorded fragments, only to those who had been watching with attention to detail. Varissa needed to create a record that would be impossible to misinterpret or suppress. She recorded her testimony in the Hall of Public Records, an archive that was legally protected from government interference. She described her childhood, her mother's suspicious death, her father's exile, the moment she had witnessed Gabriel burying a fallen enemy, and understood that everything she had believed was a constructed lie. She presented the classified files her father had gathered over 3 decades. She spoke about the human soldiers who had died in conflicts manufactured to justify Valorian military expansion. And when she finished, she made an announcement that would reshape her civilization's future. I am establishing a commission dedicated to truth and reconciliation. Every Valorian who participated in the military corruption, whether as architect or instrument, will have the opportunity to acknowledge their actions and provide testimony in exchange for amnesty, provided they cooperate fully in revealing the extent of the conspiracy. We cannot move forward while maintaining the fiction that individuals bear no responsibility for systems they serve. But neither can we heal by executing or exiling those individuals. We must face what we have done and choose to become something different. The broadcast was simultaneous, transmitted on every human and Valorian network. Gabriel and Kieran watched from the diplomatic station as Varissa's words propagated across star systems, as they took root in the consciousness of both civilizations. Gabriel turned to Kieran and allowed himself finally to smile, a full expression of the hope that had sustained him through 3 decades of exile and quiet resistance. "She is her mother's daughter," Kieran said quietly, watching his daughter address a universe she had been taught to see as enemy, and her own woman entirely. "When this is stable," Gabriel said, "I want to marry her. I want to make her part of my life formally, publicly, in whatever way both our civilizations will recognize." Kieran's expression softened. Her mother would have approved. I approve. 3 weeks later, when the immediate political fractures had begun to stabilize, Varissa returned to the frontier colony. Gabriel was waiting for her at the landing platform as her transport descended. She moved toward him as soon as the ramp cleared, and he caught her as she left the final step, spinning her in a motion that spoke of relief and reunion and absolute certainty about their future. They moved to the private quarters he had prepared, a space that overlooked the colony's gardens, furnished with objects from both human and Valorian cultures, decorated with evidence of a life they would build together. Gabriel had arranged the evening with careful attention to sensory detail, the lighting set to the spectrum that was comfortable for her Valorian eyes, food prepared using techniques her father had taught him, music that incorporated both human and Valorian instruments. When he drew her toward the sleeping area, Varissa did not resist. She had lived her entire adult life under the control of duty and protocol and the need to conceal her true self. Now, with Gabriel, she wanted to surrender to something other than obligation. He undressed her with reverence, treating her body as territory to be honored rather than conquered. His scarred hands traced the bioluminescent traceries along her spine, along her collarbone, around her breasts with the same careful attention he had used to arrange stones at a grave. She found herself gasping at the sensation. Touch that was entirely novel, sensation that had been carefully suppressed during her years of military discipline. Varissa's hands moved across Gabriel's chest, across the scars that mapped his life of service, and she understood that she was touching not just his body, but the history of his choices. Every scar represented a moment where he had chosen honor over survival. She wanted to map them all, wanted to understand the story written in his flesh. They came together slowly, a negotiation of vulnerability that transcended the physical act. Gabriel moved with the same deliberation that characterized all his actions. No rush, no demand, simply an offering of himself and a patient exploration of her response. Varissa found herself gasping his name, her bioluminescent markings flaring so bright they illuminated the entire room. When they finished, they remained tangled together, his heartbeat steady beneath her ear, her hand resting over the place where she could feel his life force moving. She had expected physical intimacy to feel like a loss of control. Instead, it felt like the final component of her reconciliation with truth. "Marry me," Gabriel said, and his voice was rough with emotion. "Tomorrow, if you will. Let me make you part of my life in every way that matters." Varissa lifted her head to look at him, and she saw in his weathered face the man who had reorganized warfare around principles of compassion, the man who had taught her what honor looked like, the man her father had chosen as worth trusting with the future of two civilizations. "Yes," she said simply. The news spread through both civilizations with the weight of symbol. A human soldier and a Valorian intelligence officer marrying in a frontier colony, it was reconciliation made manifest in the most intimate possible form. The Valorian government, now under moderate faction control, announced official recognition of the union. The human government did the same. Messages of support arrived from peace advocates across both species, alongside the inevitable hostile communications from hardliners on both sides who saw the marriage as betrayal of their people. Gabriel and Varissa did not respond to the hostility. Instead, they moved through the next weeks, focused on the work that their union symbolized. Varissa served on the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, conducting interviews with military officers who had participated in the systematic falsification of intelligence. Some came seeking amnesty and redemption. Others came defiant, unwilling to acknowledge wrongdoing. She treated both categories with the same respect, understanding that forcing confession would not heal the fracture between civilization and conscience. Her father began publishing academic analyses of the period, creating historical record that would prevent the truth from being rewritten in future generations. Gabriel continued his work training military units in the philosophy of honor, expanding his effort to include both human and Valorian soldiers who were learning to see each other as something other than existential threat. 6 weeks after the trial, a delegation from the Valorian government arrived at the frontier colony requesting formal discussion of peace treaties and reparations agreements. Varissa participated in the negotiations alongside her father and Gabriel, her unique position as bridge between cultures, giving her insights neither fully Valorian nor fully human representative could access alone. The agreements that emerged were imperfect. Reparations could not undo the deaths manufactured through decades of false conflict. Reconciliation could not erase the psychological damage of propaganda, but they represented commitment to acknowledging harm and moving towards something resembling justice. 3 months after the marriage, Varissa discovered she was pregnant. Gabriel held her after she delivered the news, his hands moving across her flat stomach with wonder. The child would be hybrid, neither fully Valorian nor human, but something new. a generation born after truth had fundamentally reorganized both civilizations' relationship to each other. A daughter, Varissa said softly, though it was too early to know gender. But she found herself certain of it, found herself imagining a girl who would grow up knowing both her cultures, understanding her parents' choice to prioritize truth over comfort. "What will we name her?" Gabriel asked. Varissa thought of her mother, whose death had catalyzed her father's exile, whose discovery of military corruption had made reconciliation possible. "Lyrian," she said, "a name that honors both cultures, a name that means bridge between worlds." Gabriel kissed her forehead, her temples, her lips. He held her as she cried, not from sorrow now, but from the overwhelming emotion of transformation. She had begun this journey as an intelligence officer devoted to perpetuating comfortable lies. She had become something entirely different. A woman who had chosen truth and had discovered that truth did not destroy connection, but rather created the only foundation upon which genuine intimacy could be built. The Joint Commission for Reconciliation held its inaugural session on a neutral space station orbiting the border between Valorian and human territory. It was symbolic architecture. The station had been built decades earlier as a contested zone, a location both civilizations claimed but neither fully controlled. Now it was being converted into a place of dialogue. Varissa stood beside Gabriel as they watched delegates from both species file into the main assembly chamber. She was visibly pregnant now, her Valorian form expanding in ways that made her partner's hand a constant presence on her lower back. Her father was already inside, consulting with the moderate faction members about protocol for the morning's discussions. "You don't have to do this," Gabriel said quietly, his scarred hand moving across the place where their child was growing. "You could rest. You could let others carry this work." "No," Varissa said, "this is exactly what I need to do. This child deserves to be born into a world where her parents fought for her future." They entered the chamber together and the room went silent. A human soldier and a Valorian officer, married and expecting a child, it was a living argument for reconciliation that no speech could equal. Varissa took her position at the commission table, and the formalities began. Reports on the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's progress. Updates on reparations agreements. Discussion of joint military protocols that would allow human and Valorian forces to work together on border security and mutual defense. It was meticulous, detailed work that had none of the drama of the trial or the intensity of their private reconciliation. It was the unglamorous business of rebuilding trust, institution by institution, protocol by protocol, conversation by conversation. But it was the work that would matter. During a break in the proceedings, Varissa found herself alone with her father in the observation gallery overlooking the primary assembly chamber. Kieran placed his weathered hand on her shoulder and she covered it with her own. "Your mother would have been very proud," Kieran said quietly. "I finally understand what you sacrificed," Varissa replied, "leaving me, leaving everything. It wasn't abandonment. It was the only way you could preserve yourself to do this work." Kieran's eyes glistened. "I have spent 30 years trying to atone for the choice I made to stay with her instead of acting sooner. I could not have protected her, but I could have prepared for what would come after." "You did," Varissa said. "You prepared by surviving, by building networks, by teaching Gabriel your philosophy of honor, by creating the infrastructure that allowed truth to eventually emerge." They stood together in silence, looking down at the chamber where delegates from two species were learning to see each other as partners rather than enemies. It was small. The room contained only a few hundred people, but the agreements being negotiated there would eventually touch billions. 3 months later, Lyrian was born on the frontier colony, in the same medical facility where her mother had recovered from her near-fatal exposure when she had launched her escape from the command center. The birth was difficult. Hybrid physiology created complications that required intervention from both human and Valorian medical specialists working together for the first time in their training. When Lyrian emerged, crying with the full force of Valorian lung capacity amplified by human vocal structures, she was perfect. Golden amber eyes, skin the color of dawn, a blend of her mother's luminous green and her father's pale human baseline. hair that would grow to shimmer with her mother's iridescence, but carried the texture of her father's more solid structure. Gabriel held his daughter while tears ran down his weathered face. He looked at Varissa, exhausted and triumphant on the medical platform, and she saw in his expression the complete dissolution of any remaining barriers between them. "She is perfect," he said simply. "She is the future," Varissa replied. 6 months later, when Lyrian was sleeping through the full nights and Varissa had regained her strength, she and Gabriel took their daughter back to Kepler 442b. They visited the burial site where Gabriel had mourned the fallen Valorian soldier, the moment that had catalyzed everything that followed. The cairn still stood, maintained by a combination of human soldiers and Valorian military delegations who had learned to see it as monument to something sacred. Gabriel knelt beside the grave, and Varissa positioned herself beside him, holding their infant daughter. Lyrian's golden eyes moved across her father's face, across the stone marker, across the landscape that contained the origin point of their entire family's existence. She could not understand the significance. She could not comprehend the revolution that this moment represented in the history of two civilizations. But she existed. She was the living proof that the future was not bound by the hatred and lies that had sustained the past. Gabriel reached out and touched the uppermost stone of the cairn. His voice, when he spoke, was barely audible. "Thank you," he said to the fallen Valorian soldier, long since decomposed, returned to the earth, no longer containing consciousness or identity. But Gabriel was not thanking the soldier himself. He was thanking the moment that soldier's death had created. He was acknowledging the sacrifice that, when honored with dignity rather than denied with propaganda, had become the beginning of reconciliation. Varissa rested her head against Gabriel's shoulder, and together they looked down at their daughter. Lyrian reached up with infant strength and grasped her father's scarred thumb, and Gabriel allowed himself a smile that contained within it all of the grief and hope and transformation that had led to this moment. Varissa stood on the plateau overlooking Kepler 442b, her Valorian form carrying the marks of her pregnancy and recovery, her bioluminescent traceries glowing softly in the gathering twilight. She held her daughter while Gabriel stood guard, and she looked out across the border world where the unthinkable had become inevitable. Her people had lied, but she had chosen truth. And that choice had made all the difference.
And that brings us to the end of today's story. Thanks for taking the time to listen. I really appreciate it. This channel is all about original human-focused science fiction, and every story is presented as a part of a larger collection. If you'd like to continue, there's another story from this channel on screen now that fits right alongside this one. Feel free to jump into that